Hi everyone, and thank you for that introduction. As well as the things that Troy outlined, I actually was a teacher as well for many, many years, and am maintaining my teaching accreditation as well, just to keep that on the back burner because I do like to jump into the classroom here and there. So today what we're going to have a look at is beyond unplugging and some digital kind of wellbeing strategies that are much more meaningful than just spend less time on your phone. We're in this absolutely hyper-connected world, and obviously throughout the pandemic, it's been a godsend for us to be able to use technology in such meaningful ways, to be able to connect and kind of stay human in this highly digitized world. So, look, I'd like to just start by giving you a moment and really kind of noticing how many mental tabs you have open, and rather than taking, giving to yourself. So how can you just, take a breath, ground into wherever you are, tune out of that monkey mind that is, already planning for next week and getting back to school for many of us. The term is starting. To ignore some of those notifications and the piling up in your inbox. To be present to some of these ideas I'm going to share over the next 45 minutes and just allow your mind to wander. Might be something that you haven't done for a little while, or maybe you're really good at self-care and you've been looking after yourself in these last couple of weeks. So the basics of my work, if you haven't met me before or seen me around the interwebs, is that I'm really about helping us de-guilt our technology use. I think there's an incredible amount of kind of polemicism to do with our screen-based media use. And it comes from, I guess, our concerns about the impact on our brain sometimes, but our brain is a masterful piece of technology, a highly complex piece of technology, and we can use this to hack back our habits, to stay really well connected and human in a digital world. By human, what I really mean is connected and empathizing with each other and sort of getting out of the busyness, getting out of the rush and tumble, and being able to be really present to what separates us from, I guess, our primate ancestors. Thinking about, for many of us, the last 18 months, and even if you're in Sydney or Melbourne, the last, gazillion weeks, just to consider some of the impacts of working from home, which I sometimes call living from work, that our lockdowns have been impacting us in incredibly different ways and has really blurred the lines between work and life, and adding to this cognitive load and the stress that many people feel. So the pandemic places much more uncertainty, I guess, over our lives, and this rolling sense of uncertainty. Again, in New South Wales, we've sort of had some changes to dates and things even overnight, and amplifying a range of vulnerabilities for many of us. We all have very different backgrounds with kids that we're trying to teach, and our own kids that we're trying to teach while working, and all of these different things that have really tested our resilience and our stress tolerance abilities. It's kind of like not having enough time to recharge your phone. You maybe recharge yourself up to about 15%, and then, by the end of the day, you're back down. So there's this idea of surge capacity that you might have heard of, and you might really want to reflect on that the constant state of uncertainty that we've been living in, and that the adaptability that we've needed to have has actually kind of depleted some of our coping strategies and the energy and the reserves that we have for being able to deal with so much uncertainty and novelty through our life. So, just really reflecting on that and reflecting on some of the things that maybe worked really well for you. So, considering then our relationship with technology and these porous boundaries between work and life, and that constant kind of notion of work-life balance, which I sometimes like to think about being a blend rather than a balance, like you're trying to get it really even. Digital nutrition is a philosophy that I created that's much more positive and proactive when it comes to considering our technology use. And initially I created this because we had so many questions about young people and their tech use, and we still have those questions. But increasingly, it's actually about us as the adults, the teachers, and the role models for young people, and us getting our habits right, because no one's given us these lessons. I guess there's, we like to Mark Prensky came up with the idea of digital native and digital immigrant, that as digital immigrants for most of us, we're still learning how to kind of get these habits right, and to really model those to young people as well. So I use this analogy with food, not drugs. Lots of people like to use the analogy with drugs on how to have a healthful digital diet, and really as an alternative to some of the terminology around digital detoxing, and the focus and the notion of screen time as being the main metric. So what I like to do here is really put the focus on our ability and our agency as humans to be conscious consumers and to make intelligent and intentional decisions about what kind of habits we have with our tech use. So when you think about this, we take, the idea of nutrition to the next level. We can think about that some online activities can be like digital candy, and others can be a little bit like digital kale. And yeah, that's broccoli, but you get my point. That adage, if you are what you eat, then how does what you scroll through and the information that you're consuming online impact your emotions and your thinking? And I guess increasingly this has sort of parlayed into the question about misinformation and sources of information. The work really kind of encompasses a lot of the media and digital literacy questions that we have and things that we're trying to teach often. So not all screen time is obviously created equally. This is a really great example, I would say, of a digitally nutritious event where you can be learning and using technology to kind of up those skills and have better insights. So, sometimes I provocatively ask questions like, why don't adults have screen time limits? Or why isn't learning included in some of those things? So to consider this relationship, we can start digging into things like virtual vitamins of what some of the online activities contain. Is there vitamin E for empathy? Are we learning to take different perspectives? Is there vitamin C for creativity? Are we actually creating and doing some of the higher order blooms kind of activities rather than just mindlessly scrolling? So we want to get beyond digital calorie counting and just looking at time online. So maybe we need nutritional labels for apps and games, or we don't talk about things like food time. We don't sit down at the dinner table and say, oh, as a family we've only got 30 minutes for food time. We actually look at what's on the plate. So similarly with our screen-based media use for work, for learning, for leisure, we could start thinking about what nutrients and additives are maybe involved in some of those activities we find ourselves being somewhat over-engaged in at times. So thinking beyond screen time and really looking at a notion called your screenome, which is kind of like your genome, how you particularly, or specifically use technology. And there's so many variations on this. Beck just gave us some fantastic examples with the surface of all the different things that it can do in the classroom, but I'm sure she takes that home and uses that herself to kind of connect with friends and to do all of the other things that we know are really, really beneficial for belonging and connection. So thinking beyond screen time, we can look at questions of the content, of actually what is it that's being engaged in, and whether or not, for instance, it's developmentally appropriate. The context, so the situation, that's zooming out and thinking about the bigger picture. And certainly, in winter, in the school holidays, when it's raining in a lockdown, screen time, of course, is going to go up. And we don't want to add guilt to the sense of that, but we might want to check that the things that kids are thinking about or ourselves are thinking about, the thoughts and motivations, those cognitions that are happening when we're maybe spending more time online, remain adaptive and helpful, and that we're, not getting into some stress and anxiety because we're consuming content that actually isn't adding to our mood and helping our mood and things like that. And then there's finally the function. So why have we got the screen in front of us to begin with? And what screen that might be. There's obviously multiple examples of different screens that we use for different things. So really zooming out and getting beyond that just time as a metric, I think, is incredibly important, and something, screen time has become this catch-all for, anything you do with screens, but we need to get a little bit more clever with how we're talking about some of these issues. And creating a healthy digital diet, what might that look like? Again, it's not about prescribing anything, but more general principles like you're planning to unplug, that you might control the portions that you're consuming. So rather than big, long stretches online, that you're more snacking throughout the day, especially with things like social media, checking in and keeping on top of things and kind of getting some of the inspiration, but also being able to curate your feed. So some of the stuff that makes you feel rubbish, you might mute or unfollow. We really want to focus on our sleep to be able to set digital sunsets and ensure that technology isn't creeping into that time. And we're going to have a look at that a little bit later, as well as just diversifying maybe our gaming diet. So for many young people, they're sort of on lots of what I call the hot chips of games. So some of the very popular and big name games, and rather than, and playing them in very traditional ways, and instead maybe playing slightly different games and different ways of playing those games. So obviously, Minecraft is a great example where kids can be doing huge variations of activities within that same space. And then looking inside and considering those virtual vitamins might be some ways that you can start thinking about creating a healthy digital diet, both for yourself, but also to have these conversations with your students and the humans that you live with. The challenge for us, I guess, is really not unplugging, but not being overplugged, because digital abstinence is completely unrealistic in 2021, both from work and from a leisure perspective. I think digital detoxing is an unhelpful way of considering this, and it links into dieting culture, which we know is quite toxic. So unless there's an opportunity to actually restructure how you're thinking about whatever habit you have, whether it's, your relationship to exercise or your relationship to checking your phone first thing in the morning, unless we really change our thinking around that, we're probably not going to make sustainable changes. So we really need to dig into the psychology that sits behind some of that. Otherwise, we get into a binge purge cycle, and we just go on a digital detox, come back and then check all of our notifications and have that sense of missing out. So we want to play into just getting some of this into a more balanced space. The 5 digital dilemmas I'm going to take you through are digital distraction, so the powerful pull of that attention economy and how some technology is designed to distract. Digital dependence, so the habit loops that are created through that design. Digital displacement, what we actually give up to participate in online spaces. Digital dementia and the deluge of too much information. And finally, digital dramas and disinhibition, so all the interpersonal issues that arise sometimes online, especially for young people. We see, some of the dramas that happen in those online spaces, but not just for young people. We see this with a lot of adults as well. So in terms of digital distraction, this is really just about the hijacking of our attention that's inherent in some social media and game design, and the way that we have that anticipation of the next notification leads to hypervigilance and really constant checking behavior. So we have even notions of nomophobia, not having your phone phobia, or phantom vibration syndrome, all of these things that we have sort of created as faux syndromes in the digital world. Part of what's happening too is we have a constant partial attention. We're monitoring lots of sources of information, and this steals away from our ability to do what Cal Newport talks about being deep work, and really being able to go and focus deeply on some of the things that are really important. Then there's technoference, so the interference of technology and it creeping into all corners of our life. Obviously, the ubiquity of some of the devices that we use is very, very handy, but then that technoference and techno creep into different areas can be part of what starts to create that ongoing distraction if we're not really wise to this and really intentional with our use. So one of the antidotes is a book that came out in 2019 and is sitting up there on my shelf, Indistractable, How to Control Your Intention and Choose Life by Nir Eyal, whose first book was Hooked, How to Make Habitual Products. So this really, just this image, I think if you're working with high school kids, this kind of sits really well and sticks with them, because we can take actions, and actions either distract us from the stuff we really care about, or they can build traction towards the stuff that we really want. And when we start looking at this model in more depth, we look at some triggers, internal and external, that actually get in the way of us staying more in traction with the things that matter. So the things that matter are, you know, technically called goals. And I know that for many of us, the idea of goal setting is quite like, oh, I don't want to do that. It doesn't sit very well. If we talk about it in terms of traction and just the stuff that you want and working towards that, that might be a way that you can start conversations to become less distracted and get more focused towards those things that we care about. Some other antidotes there is to teach attention management strategies and executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are often the things that we talk about in deficit with young people who might have ADHD. We can use these and we can talk about these skills regardless of whether there's a deficit, thinking about our ability to start activities, to maintain focus, to put in effort, to manage our emotions, and the way that attention actually works with our memory. When we think about those 4 C's of 21st century learners, I guess being able to concentrate is another layer to that we can start thinking about when we think about attention management and concentration. We can absolutely manage notifications across all of the devices. For most smartphones, there are new ways that you can take back more control over when you're interrupted and who gets to interrupt your time. Learning to take brain breaks and to do analog activities, for instance, handwriting notes. I still, you know, without throwing technology out the window, we still need kids to be able to learn to handwrite quite well. And for some of us, I know that my handwriting has really changed and not become as legible as it was maybe in 20 years ago, because I'm just not writing as often. So we, you know, might actually go back to some of those analog activities here and there. Working with and attuning to body rhythms is another really interesting one. Sometimes a little bit difficult in schools because we are kind of constrained by bell times, but understanding, you know, for many of us, I'm a night owl. I'll put my hand up and say, yep, you'll find me up and doing my best work in the evening. Whereas I know a lot of people are the 5 o'clock start team and feel most productive in the morning. So if you can work out when you're productive, then you're going to be much more likely to avoid distraction. So a lot of this is known as neuro-productivity, which is, you know, a fun one to dive into. You know, really just using neuroscience to build habits of productivity. The rise of the interest in neuroscience, especially in the, I don't know, probably the last decade, but in the interest in neuroscience in the last 30 years, we've discovered more about the brain than we did in the previous 300. It's kind of given this rise to things like productivity porn, this obsession with, you know, being productive and working harder, not smarter. The challenge is to work out what suits you and to notice that a lot of the hacks that, you know, the productivity hacks that people come up with are designed for elite cohort of usually white men who are working in tech, you know, the Silicon Valley kind of bros. And we really need to think about what's going to work for us mere mortals and us humans and female humans sometimes too, because many of those hacks are not necessarily designed for us, you know, wrangling 3 children and then 30 kids in a class as well. So just really understanding your neurobiology and working out how your brain works, as well as your own psychological biases and vulnerabilities. When we look at digital dependence, look, I'm going to kind of do a brief overview here because I don't want to get bogged down in addictions and addictive nature of some aspects of technology. It's a highly kind of contentious issue, and we simply don't have time to go into the nitty gritty of it. Despite to say, I guess gaming disorder is recognised in ICD-11, and that's a very specific diagnosis and issue that comes up for a very small proportion of people where actual reliance on technology is primarily the problem, not some of the avoidance tactics and strategies that go into dealing with difficulties in their life. So, you know, avoid the word addiction in this space and think about it more to do with dependence, because we've habituated our ability to, you know, things for me, I check my Fitbit and work out how much sleep I've done, and making sure that, you know, I feel well rested. That's a habit that I have, I guess, created. I wouldn't say I'm dependent on that. I can function in my life if I don't know that I had last night 8 hours and 22 minutes of sleep, but it actually helps me then plan my day. So you can think about where some of these little habits have been creeping in, and whether or not they're helping or hindering you. One of the antidotes to this dependence, I guess, is creating a habit of connection with people and not pixels, though, you know, sometimes pixels come with less drama than the people. We're hardwired to connect and belong. And if anything, look, we're addicted to one another. And throughout the pandemic, I think we've understood a little bit more of that, how important connection and that physical connection and touch, being physically present to people, is really important to us. You probably all have lists, if you are still in lockdown, of, you know, the people that you're going to see as soon as that, whatever date it is, I can't keep it in my mind, but whenever it is, and we can go outside of our 5 kilometres. So how can we foster more meaningful relationships with the people that you care about the most, and maybe pull back from worrying about the, you know, the opinion of a million strangers on the internet? And again, we've all seen those memes about how we suddenly get really fired up and engaged in conversations with strangers, and sometimes the people around us we're maybe not having that same level of enthusiasm for. And again, by, you know, week 15 of the pandemic, yes, we're very happy not to see the people in our household so much. The irony, obviously, is that technology has supported us in staying really connected during this lockdown. So, you know, take the best and kind of balance it out as much as you can. This one here, the digital deluge and dementia, I think is really fascinating and really valuable to our work as teachers. That, you know, our brains are ultimately really old operating systems, and we're attempting to process unprecedented amounts of information on a daily basis. So you might have heard the sort of statistic that says for us, we're consuming as much information in a day of our lives as somebody who lived in Shakespeare's time did throughout their entire life. Now, admittedly, their life expectancy was a lot lower, but if you just have a think about that, the amount of information that, even in this presentation, the cognitive load that's being, and the bits of information that are being included in this relatively short period of time is relatively high, because you're clever people who are going to process this as well, I'm sure. But this overconsumption of information and the amount of information available is what we call infobesity. Really trying to maybe, you know, curate the information that we are consuming, and being aware of our neurobiology and the impacts on things like our memory stores and how they're changing in response to this information. The idea that if you can do an internet search for some information, then your brain doesn't need to keep that fact in your brain necessarily. But we are then, hopefully, our brains are moving more towards being able to do, again, those Bloom sort of higher order thinking skills, and that focus on higher order thinking and critical and creative thinking are those skills that we really need to be able to foster. It's not necessarily being able to remember, you know, your phone number from when you were 7, or, you know, birthdays, because tech is going to be able to do that for us, but being able to do things that are really specific to us as humans, and the more complex bits and pieces. So some of the fatigue and the oversharing, the too much information that we're getting, is just through video conferencing fatigue. Whatever platform you're on, we're tired because the brain is having to work harder to monitor for nonverbal cues with just those 2D little thumbnails of information, rather than that whole human, you know, for instance, sitting in a meeting or sitting in your classroom. So remembering, for instance, to keep meetings brief, to be able to move and stretch in between them, to do things just to sit with your eyes closed and take that sensory input out of the picture, and to limit some of the information that your brain is trying to consume sometimes, and reconsidering communication channels and getting really clear on the purpose of things like some meetings. I used to say that I wouldn't go to meetings unless there was food. That was a sign of a meeting was food. So it's obviously much more difficult in this space. The antidote then is maybe really getting clear on our digital etiquette or netiquette and creating social contracts around how we're going to use communication and online communication strategies. I know as a teacher, I started using email for the Department of Ed in 2002. I have never once had a lesson on how to use it well. And most people that I speak to when I ask, have you learned how to use email? It's like, no. So maybe we need to get lessons in email. And again, author Cal Newport, who wrote Deep Work as his second book. He then wrote Digital Minimalism, and his third book is A Life Without Email, or A World Without Email, where he talks about how, to some degree, email as a back and forth tool is really not fit for purpose, that we're looking towards some of the other tools. Again, Microsoft have a range of tools, this being one of them, where we can collaborate and get beyond some of the problems of that deluge of information that's constantly coming towards us. But having really specific rules for our teams, for our classrooms, for our faculties, and learning kind of how to be more reliable and predictable with that communication, because when we have these rules, it's actually really, really helpful for us as humans to follow the bouncing ball. We love rules. So getting really specific with that and having, for instance, communication contracts or policies, it's iterative, so it's not necessarily going to fit into a policy in that kind of traditional kind of boring policy way. I'm not advocating for, tons and tons of policy and red tape, but just conversations where you share out lots of different ways to use that communication. I've got even a course on inbox manageable, not inbox zero, but manageable, to help you try and pull these things apart for your team. Another antidote is to ditch FOMO and FOFO, so fear of finding out. We're probably all familiar with FOMO, fear of missing out, but FOFO is fear of finding out, and usually that was happening at the 11 o'clock press conference. So be okay with not keeping up with so many sources of information or TV shows or news or gossip and all the things that, we constantly are trying to maybe for many people, it's kind of like the kind of trashy mag. It's a little bit of, escapism and things like that. But certainly when it comes to really important information, we want to be going to clear sources of trusted information. Noticing when we're doom scrolling, noticing when we're kind of going down that rabbit hole, and being able to be more selective with what we allow for us to kind of get into our synapses, get into our eyeballs, and to get our attention. We need to, I think, practice more monotasking. Monotasking is another skill that we severely overlook, and the idea of being able to do lots of things at once, though maybe inbuilt to some of our female brains, is not necessarily great for us. That mental load that lots of women carry, keeping on top of lots of things. So reconnect with real sources of joy, not those immediate sort of senses of distraction and comfort. So think about what tabs you can close and think about where you can get joy from missing out. Finally, digital displacement. We do only have 24 hours in the day. Yes, you have the same number of hours as Beyonce, but she has very different resources. I'm guessing she's got personal chefs and she does not fold her own washing. So for us, again, mere mortals, trying to juggle lots of different things, we really want to make sure that our technology use is not displacing really important pillars of wellbeing, which are things like sleep and movement or exercise. So we do have data that shows as tech use is going up, there are people who are sleeping less. And for many of you, you will notice young people being very, very tired when they're coming into your classrooms, often because their sleep is being impacted by late night group DM sessions or gaming sessions or different things that kind of get in the way of them prioritizing sleep. Sleep deprivation, I could talk for hours about sleep and how important it is, but really significant impacts on three main areas: on mood, on metabolism, and on memory. And these, again, very central to our well-being, and we really would benefit from being able to prioritize rest. And especially in a wake-centric culture, I guess, where there's constantly more stuff to get done. Again, that balance of work and life is really hard when there's more and more work. When we've found that we haven't needed to commute to work during the pandemic, but the time that we could have put into into commuting has generally, research is showing, been reinvested into work, not necessarily reinvested into getting more sleep or doing more exercise. So prioritizing rest, yeah. I love this meme. I'm making a vision board and she's sewing that she's going to get more sleep. Oh, memes. I could just do a presentation about the psychology of memes and how a little bit of resonating with, you know, these ideas and a giggle or two can be very, very good for our well-being. So, you know, using sleep as an act of self-care and to get out of that pursuit of work-life balance when work just keeps growing. So the antidote as well might be ditching balance, and I've written quite a bit about why I call BS on the notion of balance to find that optimal blend. This is from Dan Siegel's Healthy Brain Platter or Healthy Mind Platter. It's 10 years old actually. I just wrote a blog about how this still rings true 10 years later. And thinking about, again, with that analogy of food on your plate or over that 24 hours of the day or 168 hours of your week, are you getting enough time to play and to connect with people, to have some downtime and just time with the insides of your brain and the quietness or the noise, as it might be, within your mind? Ditching some digital dramas as well here. So the digital dramas often happen because there's this thing called the digital disinhibition effect, and it comes up because we're not looking at one another. We forget that on the other side of the screen, when we're, you know, madly replying to a tweet or whatever it might be, for young people it's often DMs or comments, we're not connecting with that person. And eye contact is really what kickstarts kindness and empathy. It's a key way that as humans we get sensory information is through the eyeballs. So when we don't have that, and, you know, this whole presentation, I'm imagining, you know, thousands of you out there smiling at me and nodding along to this presentation like you would hopefully when, you know, in an auditorium, that without this is where some of the digital dramas happen, and that disinhibition effect really can impact the way that we connect. The other aspect to this too, I guess, is that young people in these digital spaces, because their social emotional skills are still very nascent, they're still learning how to interact, what their identity is, how they, all the kind of social glue and the social situations that they're in. They're learning this often through these mediated spaces or the online spaces. So their communication is mediated through technology, and their wiring is just not quite there to cope with some of the ways that these dramas play out. And again, for lots of the executives that I work with, often they're spending more and more time dealing with some of these dramas and the friendship issues that come up in online spaces, which, you know, are not all that different to offline, but they play out differently because of the amplification, I guess, of some of these spaces. They're also not necessarily during school hours, so it does add to some of the resourcing issues that often schools are dealing with, that come and seek some support from me on. So the antidote, I believe, here is to apply the 3 M's of digital nutrition, which is to really think of these as lenses or ways that you can approach your tech use, especially, I guess, the tech use for leisure, that you're more mindful, being present to your actions and having awareness of and responsibility over activities online, to be able to try and pause and think more broadly about what you do, what you say, what you click on, what you like, you know, and what you scroll through, and how this can impact your overall well-being. Meaningful, that you have a sense of purpose and clarity in terms of what you're reading and commenting on, and you know, are these things sort of aligned to the stuff that you really care about? So to go back to Nia's example of Indistractable, research shows actually that when it comes to platforms like Instagram, with a sample of young women, when they curated their feed so that they were consuming information that was more aligned to their values and the career path that they were interested in, they had positive mental health outcomes. So very simply, we can kind of shift and add more meaning into some of the things that we're consuming online, and that can have some of the positive impacts that we do know exist. It's not all bad in that space, despite the headlines. And then moderate. Consider moderating your technology use, both in terms of time. Absolutely, time is still a factor, don't get me wrong, but also moderating how you respond and tempering how you respond. So being able to have a little bit more equanimity with how you respond to things online and how you react to things. Remembering that, you know, for often it's late at night when we're kind of online and we're responding to things, and we're sometimes really tired. Our prefrontal cortex is probably clocked off for the night. We maybe have had a, you know, gin and tonic, and be in a space that 9 o'clock the next morning we wouldn't necessarily post in that way. So they're the 3 M's of digital nutrition: mindful, meaningful, and moderate, as an antidote for those digital dramas. I guess my point here too is that the digital wellbeing playbook is a very new one. There is no single right way to manage your digital wellbeing, apart from to tune in with what works for you and what you know about yourself. And I guess knowing yourself and knowing what you need in this space and what your vulnerabilities are it's a work in progress. So it requires us to be aware of the psychological and digital issues at play, the technological issues at play, which I hope today I've kind of given you some insights into. Yeah, there's some really great basics out there that we know based on common sense, but you get to design your own adventure. So when it comes to, you know, how many minutes of screen-free time before bed do I need? Well, that's going to depend a lot on what you consume, and it's going to depend on whether or not you're limiting the blue light coming from that device. So I can't say it needs to be 60 minutes or 20 minutes or anything like that. I'm going to say to you, go and use some of these principles and develop this for what works for you and what works for your family or your household, and then maybe your classroom. So in terms of, I guess, maybe whoever's out there who wants to check in with what's happening in the Twitter feed, whether we've got any questions, anything that you want me to answer before, we're going to jump onto having a panel and talk about some of these issues in more depth. But there's lots of ways that you can keep in touch and continue learning from some of the principles that I'm sharing.